Did you ever work on a crisis where you used the Tylenol recall case study as a model?
Well, it's always in the background, I think, because the thing that Tylenol taught us is how good it can be to take kind of audacious and unequivocal steps to protect your customers and in so doing protect your brand. So I think that that certainly has always been in the background. The case that comes closest to a Tylenol level case is, and I'll try to protect client confidentiality to the degree possible in all this. I worked with an international organization that made and makes still a product for toddlers, babies, that when used properly was safe. The problem is it was very easy to use it improperly and put the baby in danger, and that's how parents generally use the product. It was a product that you could put a baby, place a baby in, and its intended use was to put the baby in this little contraption on the floor, and the baby for the first time would be able to sit up and actually, interact with his or her parent prior to having the skeletal musculature capabilities of actually sitting up on their own. So it kind of advanced the parent-child interaction, by a month or two. But what happened is that parents then would take that device and they'd put it on the countertop. And then they'd turn their back and the baby would squirm out of it and then fall the 4 feet onto the floor. And this was happening a lot. And the company was contacted by the Consumer Product Safety Commission and was required to do a recall. So that was really the biggest international recall that I was involved in. And certainly in that case, as the public relations voice that was engaged to help, doing something that was emphatic, that was definitive, that was kind of a stake in the ground about what we believe in as an organization, that all derives from Tylenol.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Dan Keeney. He's a PR veteran and a crisis communications pro. Today we're going to tell the story of the crisis that ushered in the modern era of crisis communications, the 1982 Tylenol poisonings. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. This is the first of a two-part series that digs into what made the Tylenol situation a game changer and how Tylenol found a way to bounce back. In the process, the company created a classic case study that is still analyzed today. Dan, you've worked on crisis communications for years. Can you tell me how you got into that niche and a little bit about your crisis communications experience?
I transitioned from a career in radio. I was first a radio reporter, then a news director, and then later at the network level was in news decision making. And when I transitioned to public relations, coming out with a decade in the newsroom, I was deployed fairly quickly in a number of, probably in the bigger scheme of things, minor crises. But it gave me, my sea legs in that arena. And we did actually do some really interesting work during that brief amount of time. One of them I still tell, and people are agog at it, the concept that during the period not long after the fall of the Iron Curtain, there were these instances where Russian gangs were doing all sorts of strange things to get toxic waste out of Russia. And I'm not sure what the economic model in that was, but we had a client at one point that was discovered to have had toxic waste in their barrels that were being going intercontinentally across the continent of Europe. And it was just that their barrels had been stolen. It wasn't that they had anything to do with it, but these Russian gangs had stolen barrels, and then almost like a Breaking Bad type of scenario, they were transporting toxic nuclear waste across country lines. I think it was going from Russia into East Germany or something. So you get some cases like that, and very quickly you learn that how valuable it is to accept that you don't know everything. And that's one of the key values of a PR counselor, I think, in the crisis stage is just having an acceptance that we are going to have to operate with a sliver of information about whatever it is that we're dealing with.
What did you do in that situation with those barrels?
It was, I gotta say, I was way down the food chain of people who were involved in that, but it was brought to the client's attention by, I believe, 2020. I mean, it was immediately a big deal. The way it was discovered is simply that there was a news crew in Eastern Europe who had done an investigative report disclosing and revealing this underworld trade in nuclear waste, or efforts to dispose of nuclear waste. And the client's barrel was photographed, videotaped at that time with their logo and everything. So it was not a question of whether or not that was their barrel. It was their barrel. The question for the client was, well, how did our barrel end up there? So it was just a matter of making clear to the news crew that this was a case in which we too were a victim. And that's not completely out of the realm of Tylenol too. And making sure that everybody understood that we were taking steps to ensure the security of, and when I say we, I mean the client, of all of our stuff, our barrels and the things that were in the barrels. And by no stretch was this client involved in any way in energy or nuclear or toxic waste. Their materials that they transported in barrels were completely just innocuous, metals.
So let's set the stage. The Tylenol poisonings of 1982 have been described as the recall that started them all. That's how the New York Times described it. But it was much more than a recall, wasn't it? It was the story of 7 people who died after taking Tylenol capsules. Someone tampered with those capsules by inserting cyanide into them. This is the story of the CEO who had to make some tough decisions that no other CEO had ever dared to make before that. So Dan, let's start with this question. Would you say that the Tylenol case study is as relevant today as it might have been 10, 20, 30 years ago?
In some cases, in some elements, I should say, I think so. In terms of the importance of having the attention of the people at the very top of the organization and having their commitment to doing, not only saying what is right, but doing what is right, I think that will stand the test of time for as long as we can imagine. There are some elements I think are kind of quaint, this concept of a public that is willing to give a company the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if you really think about this, there was a lot of trust that remained with Johnson & Johnson throughout the entire episode. Johnson & Johnson even was involved in the testing of the tainted drugs. I just find that flabbergasting in today's age, the thought that both the government and just the public would allow an organization that had to have been under scrutiny at that point to be the one to test the materials that were believed to be poisonous, and to then, based on that testing, come to a conclusion. So I think that's interesting. And then obviously the timing. I mean, there were days that went by, there were weekends that went by. I think that that's just not possible today. We're talking about minutes. We're talking about tweet storms. We're talking about politicians who use social media as their bully pulpit. There are elements of it that are templates for how organizations can respond in the right way, but there are elements of it that seem like from a different age and a different culture.
It all started on September 29th, 1982. Mary Kellerman, a 12-year-old girl who lived in a suburb of Chicago called Elk Grove Village, told her mother and dad that she had a sore throat and a runny nose. So she took one extra strength Tylenol capsule. And what no one knew then was that it was laced with potassium cyanide poison, and she died that morning. Later that day, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janis of Arlington Heights in Chicago area, he apparently died of a heart attack. At least that's what people thought. But that turned out to be cyanide poisoning. Later in the day, the family came over to Adam's house. So Adam's brother, Stanley, and Stanley's wife, Teresa, came over. They were with the family in the aftermath of Adam's death. And with all of that stress, they took some Tylenol extra strength capsules that happened to be in Adam's house. They happened to be the same the capsules from the same bottle that Adam used earlier that day. So needless to say, Stanley died the same day as his brother, and 2 days later, Stanley's wife Teresa died, all from taking Tylenol extra strength from the same bottle. So in the end, 7 people had died in the span of a few days, and all of them had taken Tylenol extra strength, and all were from the Chicago area.
As tragic as that is, with multiple people in the same family dying, that probably saved a lot of other lives, because I would imagine that made a big difference in how quickly the authorities were able to kind of piece together what was happening.
So Dan, what about the company? What happened at the company level? How did it all happen there?
As I understand it, the first call came in the next morning. So this would be on Thursday morning, September 30th. It was from a consumer reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times. Neither that reporter nor the company executives, it turns out, really knew what the call was really about. The reporter, as a lot of reporters are, especially early in their careers, they get assigned to something, they don't really understand the full context of it. Johnson & Johnson at the time, it's important to understand, they owned lots of companies, 150 companies in all. One of them was called McNeil Consumer Products. That was the maker of Tylenol. So just to get people's head around how all this goes, Johnson & Johnson is kind of that parent holding company, and McNeil Consumer Products is the real manufacturer of Tylenol and marketer as well. As a matter of routine, the PR manager said, "Hey, I'll check with McNeil, I'll call you back." And when the PR guy then reached down to his peer at McNeil, he learned that something bad was going on in Chicago. That person had said, "Are you calling about the poisonings?" And that was the first he had learned that there was a poisoning. So by then, the Sun-Times reporter was back on the line. As I understand it, based on the descriptions, that reporter sounded breathless, was clearly excited, and he said the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office was reporting that 3 people had died in Chicago after being poisoned by Tylenol capsules. And as I understand it, there was a big series of kind of lucky breaks, one of which was that firefighter and a paramedic who had both kind of been listening to their scanners had independently heard references to Tylenol over the scanner airwaves. And then they kind of had, I don't know if they were meeting or had a conversation, but they were among those. The medical examiner was also among them, who kind of were putting these pieces together. And fairly quickly, given how complicated this problem was, fairly quickly came to the conclusion that Tylenol was at the heart of these poisonings. Anyway, that reporter was urgently in need of a comment because this was a breaking story, and they were going to be featuring the story in the next day's paper. And that's another part of the quaintness. Isn't that interesting? That reporter would have no ability to communicate this publicly until about 4 a.m. the next day.
That is a sign of the times. You mentioned the speed, though, and that is one of the more amazing things about this, because we've already talked about the speed of social media today and how fast things break, and you just mentioned about having newspaper deadlines guiding the disclosure of all this information to the public, and it's almost hard to believe today in today's context. But believe it or not, word did travel fast. It traveled very fast. In fact, it got up to the chairman's office, James Burke. James Burke was the chairman of Johnson & Johnson, and as you mentioned, Johnson & Johnson was the parent company of over 150 other companies. McNeil Consumer Products was just one of those companies, and Tylenol was just one of its brands. So that's how far down it was to James Burke. But James Burke was brought to his attention within minutes. And then James called the head of McNeil at that time, that was David Collins, and he assigned him the job of being the basically crisis manager, the one to lead the crisis response team. So David Collins went to McNeil's offices and set up a command center, and he sent some people to Chicago to put some boots on the ground. That is the immediate reaction on the corporate side. That's the kind of thing that we would, in PR, that's the kind of thing that we would see behind the scenes while all of this is happening. And really, even with today's social media world and digital world, that same process would take place. The only difference would be they wouldn't be working towards a print deadline of the next morning. They would already be dealing with viral videos and things like that. So at that time, we still have to go back to the energy level. The phones were ringing like crazy at McNeil and at Johnson & Johnson. The first wave of calls that happened then would be similar to what we would see today. The media was the first wave. TV, radio stations, and newspapers from all over the world. The next wave, now if this were today, that next wave would be minutes later. But the next wave came from pharmacies and doctors and hospitals and poison control centers. And at that time, it was kind of amusing because it said hundreds of consumers. Today, that would be millions of consumers. But they wanted information. They wanted assurances. That hasn't changed. The company started to get false reports of poisonings in other places. So the first things they had to do then is what we would have to do today, and that is they had to put to rest any kind of rumors or speculation, and they had to sort out fact from fiction. And what they realized was they were getting some of their best information from the media that was calling in. So they spent their day verifying facts, checking facts. Collins, who was in charge now of the McNeil team, they were already convinced that the poisonings did not occur at their plant because, as you mentioned, some of that information that they were getting indicated that the cyanide was isolated to Chicago, and they felt that if someone dumped a dose of cyanide small enough to escape their detection into one of their own drug mixing machines, that the mixture would have been so diluted that it would have been harmless, and the contaminated pills would have ended up all over the country, not just in Chicago. And also, they looked at the samples from the lot that you mentioned that the company tested itself. The lot that they tested turned out to be okay. So on Friday morning, the company learned that a sixth victim had died, and that victim was poisoned with Tylenol capsules from another manufacturing plant. They were capsules that were manufactured in another plant, one in Round Rock, Texas. What that confirmed to the company was that the tampering had to have taken place in Chicago, either at the retail or distribution level, but not at the manufacturing level. And that was a key turning point early on because poisoning at both plants would have been almost impossible. If you're the PR person at that time, or if that happens to you even today, what questions are on your mind when you start to see all of this stuff unfold and sort of take on a life of its own?
My first inclination is to care for those who have been harmed. And that's where you sometimes get crosswise with the attorneys, because the attorneys immediately will suggest that any kind of outreach to those families will be an acknowledgement of responsibility. But that's where I would immediately want to be spending some attention is making sure that they know that how serious we're taking this and show a compassionate side to those families. And that then extends into all the rest of our customer population, making sure that they are safe, number one, and then that they, by extension, know that this is something we're taking seriously and we're taking, all available precautions to ensure that they are safe. So I guess that's, you asked what kind of questions I would have. I would have questions related to, there will be plenty of people handling the side trying to figure out what happened and how it happened. And I would be more thinking about how do we keep our employees focused on the task at hand, because the task has just gotten a lot more complicated. And how do I provide the most valuable service to the people who are in a position of making decisions. So a lot of times that's simply streamlining communications, making sure the right people have access to the right information in as rapid time frame as possible.
That's what Burke did, the chairman, James Burke. He prioritized working with the company. He focused on communication pretty quickly. He worked with the police, the health authorities, in investigating the crimes. That Monday, and as you mentioned, these were days that have passed. That Monday, he went to Washington, and he met with the FBI and the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. He already wanted to recall all extra-strength Tylenol capsules, but the FBI and the FDA did not want him to. Their point of view was that the perpetrator of the poisonings may think it's winning by bringing this major company to its knees, and the FDA thought that if they recalled all of those capsules, it might actually cause more panic. Over the weekend, there was a copycat strychnine poisoning with Tylenol capsules in California, so that's when the FDA agreed with Burke that he had to recall all Tylenol capsules. That meant 31 million bottles with a retail of over $100 million were recalled. The company put advertisements out promising to exchange those tablets for capsules through thousands of letters to the trade media and through statements to the media because the company wanted to clarify things. In fact, the president of McNeil said they wanted to make sure that everybody had all of the facts, that the problem was limited to one area of the country, and that only bottles of Tylenol capsules, not other Tylenol products, were contaminated. And from the outset, Johnson & Johnson's response was notable for its candor. That's probably the one legacy of this, is the candor. That was something new. The afternoon of the first deaths, the company set up a toll-free number manned by company employees. It sent out 450,000 messages to doctors' offices, hospitals, and trade groups, and it stopped all Tylenol marketing advertising. What made this response different from anything that a company might have done before with a similar type of problem?
Well, the thing is, there had not been a similar type of problem. This really was the end of the innocence for U.S. and really international consumers. There had not been a breach of the public's kind of trust and safety like this. So, but what made it different, I think, was the speed at which they worked. This was not something that was driven. I was talking in my opening description of my work that so often an organization is kind of dragged kicking and screaming to a recall because it's financially devastating for a lot of organizations. And so you wait, even though you might be aware that there are issues with the safety of a product or the use, the way the product is used, you kind of wait for the Consumer Product Safety Commission to come knocking. And once they do, then the clock begins to tick on how a recall is going to happen. But in this case, it was a recall driven by the urgent belief among the highest levels of the company, that they needed to do something quickly. Now, it's interesting, I think, going back, I think it's interesting that this is kind of a commentary on human nature. There was absolutely no evidence that the poisoned Tylenol extended beyond the Chicago market. And yet, because there was an expectation that people are so horrible that we're inevitably going to have copycats, which happened, that it would be better just to take it all off the shelf and relieve us of the strain of having, instead of one city bit of panic, having multiple cases of people being finding poison in their Tylenol capsules. So I think that's kind of an interesting commentary as well.
Well, in the end, there were 8 million capsules that Tylenol or Johnson & Johnson tested for poison. And out of those 8 million capsules, 75 were found to contain cyanide. That's 75 that had not yet been ingested by a consumer. All were for sale in the Chicago area, and as we know, the perpetrator was never found. Now that Johnson & Johnson had the immediate crisis behind it, it faced a huge challenge in trying to mount a comeback for the brand, but even more important, to rebuild trust. That's going to be the focus of our next episode. Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a complete bio on our guest, Dan Keeney, and you'll get links to some of the great articles and stories on the Tylenol recall story. You can also listen to other episodes. And don't miss our next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.